Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Conflict and Compromise, the LGBT+ community. I am Milan Berg, this is Hannah Ritter, and in today's podcast episode, we will be focusing on the AIDS crisis and how it affected the community. Let's get started.
In the late 20th century, the AIDS crisis hit America and predominantly, but not solely, affected gay and bisexual men. Over 14,000 men in the United States had contracted the disease. The epidemic made many people incredibly susceptible to contracting the disease during this time.
Yet, in the 1970s, the gay community fought for their own healthcare benefits and left out many other suffering members of the queer community, such as bisexual men, who therefore struggled to get the healthcare they so desperately needed. For example, most HIV and STI prevention programs don't adequately address the health needs of bisexuals, much less those who have sex with both men and women but do not identify as bisexual.
AIDS became such a problem that there were protests to illustrate the impact on the community, as well as fight against cuts to crucial programs that gave health benefits to those afflicted. Even those who were not a part of the general queer community began to gain a sense of empathy through the commonality of AIDS. Disease spread, afflicting friends and family members of people across America. But although awareness was rising, many of those who had contracted the disease did not fit the cookie-cutter mold of an American afflicted with AIDS. Such people were bisexual men, and they did not get the treatment they needed and suffered because of it.
Now, let's take a look at some of the media produced in response to the AIDS epidemic. You can follow along with our descriptions with images we have included on our website, located on the transcript page for episode 3.
In a photograph titled "Demonstrators," two men are being taken away in handcuffs while a large group of policemen stand behind them. One man stands wearing a shirt saying, "AIDS cuts kill," while the other is yelling in protest.
You wouldn't be able to tell their identity from the picture alone, but this is significant because of the generalization of AIDS being an inclusively gay, not bisexual affliction. A poster illustrates a snake coiled around an apple and could be interpreted as the snake seen in the biblical story of Adam and Eve.
It is an allegory to the relationship between good and evil in religion and can possibly be a representation of how the AIDS crisis became the evil snake that was suffocating good humanity, which can only be stopped by AIDS prevention.
An illustration of the first accused man on trial that was diagnosed with AIDS shows Eddie Coxum during his murder trial. He had been diagnosed with AIDS shortly before the trial and thereafter faced a lot of prejudice against him in court, leading to the wearing of masks and in some cases gloves by him and court officers.
In a photograph of a rally and protest in the fight for AIDS, men and women who have been affected are gathered. A man holding a sign utilizes the phrase, "Fight AIDS, not gays."
The use of the term gays by the man holding the sign perpetuates the visualization of a gay, but not including the bisexual community.
Now, to a more open-ended part of the podcast. Some discussion questions that we will be examining, starting with, would gay men have openly acknowledged that bisexual men were just as affected during this crisis?
While gay men may have acknowledged the simultaneous suffering of many bisexual men that had contracted AIDS, a majority may have not wanted to admit that bisexual men were just as affected during the crisis as they were.
Biphobia and skepticism of the legitimacy of the bisexual community has settled in, and the suffering of bisexuals has been cast aside.
During protest, while bisexual men were indeed present, they may not have been welcomed with open arms into the demonstrations. We asked, what more could have been done to make these protests a more inclusive event?
To make the protests a more inclusive event, especially with regards to bisexual men, it may have helped to raise more awareness about the commonality and nature of the disease and how it had reached near and far within the gay, bisexual, and queer community.
The protest could have included not only the words gay, but should have been more specific to whom the fight was for. For example, if people had included signs, legislation, etc., written with the intent of addressing primarily gay and bisexual men.
That brings us to the end of the discussion and also of our podcast episode. This has been Conflict and Compromise, the LGBT+ community. Thank you for listening, and we hope you tune in for our next edition, Havens for the Community.